Hey guys, this is Ms.A, and in this lesson, we are going to be focusing on how line breaks can affect the structure and meaning of a poem. All right, so today we're going to look at poetic structure and how the structure of a poem can actually be used by a poet to help them develop the theme of their poem. So, poems, just like stories, have patterns that can help readers interpret the poet's message. The way that a poem is organized is called its poetic structure. So if you look at the example image on the right, you'll see that this poem is broken into three different stanzas. And you can see that the lines are all different lengths. And so all of that, looking at the number of stanzas, how many lines are in each stanza, the length of the lines, are all part of the poem's structure. So a stanza, hopefully we all know, is a group of lines that divides up a poem. It's basically kind of like the paragraph of a poem. So the same way you would break a piece of writing into different paragraphs based on the topic and the ideas that are similar, you want to kind of group them together. You would do the same thing with stanzas in a poem. So stanzas work together to build up either an image, a thought, or a feeling. So they can be built around similar ideas, a similar meaning. They can also, depending on the type of poem, be used to help create the rhythm of the poem. All right, and now theme, we should also know, is the lesson or the insight about life or human behavior that a story reveals. So all stories or poems are going to have a topic. Usually they have more than one topic if it's a lengthier work, but if it's a shorter work, it might just be one main topic. It might be that the text is about friendship, or it's about love, or it's about death. And then based on that topic, if you think about the key ideas in that text, you can get a more elaborate lesson. So it's what the text is teaching you about friendship based on the way the characters behave or the way the conflict unfolds. It's what the text is teaching you about love, again, for the same thing, based on the way the characters behave, the way the conflict unfolds. All right, so what's the difference between a subject and a theme? So a subject or a topic you express in a word or a phrase. It's what the story or the text is about. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, every story has many subjects. A lot of people will mistakenly say that the theme of a text is just a topic. They'll say, oh, it's the theme of love, the theme of family. And even saying mistakenly is not 100% accurate. Of course, these are themes, but they're just kind of like the seed of the theme. You have to be a little bit more specific. You've got to take that subject or topic and extrapolate it into the actual longer lesson that the text is teaching. So what is it that the text is saying about family? What are they saying about friendship? What are they saying about growing up? So theme can be expressed in a sentence, maybe two or three, but usually one sentence should be enough. It is the author's opinion or their perspective about the subject. It must be arguable. So it has to be something that not everybody necessarily would agree with. There's got to be, it's open-ended, many sides to that issue. It has to make a statement about the nature of humankind in very universal terms. So you can't say that the lesson is that Harry Potter is a hero. That's way too specific to that one book and that one character. But based on the fact that Harry was a hero, you might be able to say something in general about life and heroes and what makes a hero. It requires much more sophisticated thought than the other two. And one novel, like I said, if it's a long work, could have many themes. All right, so now let's start looking at sentences within poems, because if we're going to look at structure, then we really do need to look at the way a poem is organized and how sentences fit into it. A lot of times people don't really think about sentences when they're reading a poem, and it's one of the chief causes of misunderstanding when you're reading a poem. A lot of people focus on the fact that poems are written in verse form and that the end of the line in their head is the end of the sentence. And when you read it that way, you could end up misunderstanding key ideas, because if a sentence carries over into another line and you're just kind of reading it line by line, you're reading incomplete thoughts. So again, a verse is any division or grouping of words in a poem, and the groupings of the verse are referred to as stanzas. So here's one of my favorite poems from childhood. It's from a very well-known poet, Jack Prelutsky, and it's called Homework or Homework. Homework, oh homework, I hate you, you stink. I wish I could wash you away in the sink. If only a bomb would explode you to bits. Homework, oh homework, you're giving me fits. I'd rather take baths with a man-eating shark or wrestle a lion alone in the dark. Eat spinach and liver, pet 10 porcupines, then tackle the homework my teacher assigns. All right, so you can see from this poem, and it's not the whole poem, I just took the first two stanzas, but you can see that this group right here is stanza number 1, and this group right here is stanza number 2. So once again, this is known as verse form. It's verse form because it's basically the opposite of prose. Prose is everything that's not poetry. It's where you write across the entire line, and you only go to the next line when you reach the margins at the end of the page. But here in verse form, your line breaks can be basically wherever you want it. And so then the poem looks like what we think of when we think of poems. All right, so when writing a poet may choose to continue writing their sentence across several lines. So basically, the end of a line may not be the end of the sentence. And this is important because you want to recognize where sentences end, because where the sentence ends in a poem can affect the way we read and understand it. So here's an excerpt from another poem I love called The Dead by Billy Collins. Here you can see that the first line is actually the end of the first sentence, but then lines 2, 3, and 4 are actually all one sentence. Now, how is it that I know? How is it that I know that they're all one sentence? How do you really know when a sentence is ended? Easy. You look for the end punctuation. So you're looking for either a period, an exclamation mark, or a question mark. Here in the first line, we have the period. The second line actually ends with a comma, which means it is not the end of the sentence. It doesn't end until the period at the end of line 4. All right, so what we just looked at in the previous slide is something that's called enjambment. Enjambment is basically where the lines are not the end of the sentence. So enjambed lines are lines where the line ends in the middle of a sentence. Therefore, the sentence continues across several lines of poetry. So that's what we saw with Billy Collins' The Dead. The very first line is the opposite of enjambment. It's called an end stop line. It's where the end of the line is the end of the sentence. And then this right here is an example of enjambment. Again, it's where the sentence does not end at the end of the line. It continues across the next line and possibly several lines, depending on the poem. So you can see here's another example. This comes from an Emily Dickinson poem. And once again, you have the end of the line, which is not the end of the sentence. The sentence is continuing. So why would a poet want to write in this way? Well, basically, enjambed lines can help the poet emphasize important words, and it can also hint at double meaning. So it's just another technique that a poet can use to call attention to things that they find to be important. They're basically trying to call attention to something to the reader. So enjambed lines help the poet emphasize important words. It can hint at double meanings. How does enjambment do that? What do we even mean by double meanings? Double meanings is like where a word means one thing, but could also have a second meaning. So enjambment can do that because readers are going to naturally focus on words that are at the end of lines. They're going to focus at words that are at the beginning of a line, and they're going to focus on words that are alone in a line, especially if the rest of the poem's lines are longer legs. So as a reader, you want to ask yourself, why did the poet end the line here? As a poet, you're basically the god of your poem. You can do whatever you want. If you want your poem to have really long lines, no one's stopping you. If you want them to have lines that only have one word on them, nobody's stopping you. You can do it. You're going to make choices that help develop a rhythm of your poem, that help to emphasize meaning. So your choices matter. Now, as the reader, you want to really think about, if I was the poet, why would I have arranged the poem this way? What is it that I want the reader to focus on? All right, so for independent practice, we're going to see a couple of excerpts from different poems, and we're going to identify if the excerpt is an example of lines that are end-stopped. Remember, end-stopped means that the sentence is the end of the line, Or if it's enjambed. Again, remember that means that the end of the line is not the end of the sentence, that the sentence actually carries over to at least two or more lines. All right, so number one, I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable, and then it was. Is this an example of end stopped or enjam? Number two, the sun that brief December day rose cheerless over hills of gray. Number three, when thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, and sad images of the stern agony and shroud and pall. All right, so for our next questions, we're going to talk about why poets use either end stop lines or enjambment. So using end stop lines can create what type of mood? Is it A, disappointing, B, serious, C, cautious, or D, conversational? And for our last question, what is one purpose for using enjam lines? Is it A, to call attention to the words, B, to make line lengths even, C, to allow the reader time to reflect, or D, to make the poem sound rhythmic? All right, so now that we're done with the lesson, we will continue with this topic during tomorrow's class. Looking forward to seeing you then.